This guy is a brilliant legal analyst. You hear him across British media. You see him on television on Fox 5 in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. All the major media cities are trying to get a chunk of David Katz because he is so brilliant in breaking things down and giving you the legal realities on any number of issues. We'll try to get to as many as we can today. How about it for the former federal prosecutor, David Katz, now the defense lawyer working here in California, in Southern California.
Good to be
David,
with you,
yes,
Mark.
great to see you. You look just like you do on television. It's really cool to you have been a busy kid, haven't you? Wow.
Well, I haven't. One of the most interesting ones is last Wednesday. This is before the judge in Atlanta had ruled. On Wednesday, I was on a really right-wing station, but the presenter's always been very fair to me. He lets me tell my side of the story. I was on with somebody, deep in the Trump campaign on the other side, and they were crowing about the fact that the judge had thrown out 6 of the charges against Trump and some of his co-defendants down in the Atlanta state case. And of course, they were trumpeting that it was a harbinger of 2 days later, he was going to throw Fani Willis off the case. And I said to them, hold the celebration, because I think the fact that the judge wanted to get to that issue on Wednesday that you're crowing about shows that he's not going to bring this case to its knees on Friday, because if he were going to bring it to its knees on Friday, which is what would have happened if he'd have thrown Fani Willis off the case, I also predicted that he would throw the special prosecutor effectively off the case, which is what happened. So as I always say, it's hard to predict, especially the future, and even harder when people are poo-pooing you right to your face. But that's why it's actually fun if they're fair to you. I used to be on with Laura Ingraham a little bit, and Laura was not fair to me. She cut me off and wouldn't let me say what I wanted to say. But they actually did, and this is a big right-wing medium, a la Fox at night. But they were very fair to me, and they let me tell my side of the story. And I think it's really important. My friend Adam Schiff said years ago, you need to go on right-wing media. You need to not just have an echo chamber on the left and an echo chamber on the right. If they'll invite you on, go on. And there were some people there who just thought Fani Willis had done was terrible, and any judge in America would throw her off the case. What he did do the other day, Mark, is allow an appeal, but he didn't stay the case. So he's proceeding with all the case down there in Atlanta, Georgia, as against the 10 or 11 defendants who are left, including Trump, Giuliani, Meadows. But at the same time, he's allowing them to bring an appeal at the same time. So if the appeal court rules in their favor and they say that Fani Willis should be taken off the case in her whole office, then, of course, it'll grind to a halt at that point. But while they do their briefing, and we haven't seen some of this in the federal system, right, Mark? We've seen it quite differently. But while they're doing the briefing in the state appellate court, everything in the state court is going to proceed in the trial court. And then if they agree with the judge that Fani Willis, while what she did showed tremendously poor judgment, as he said, but she can still stay on the case because she does not have an actual conflict of interest, then everything will roll along. Do I doubt that this case will really go to its very long trial and to a verdict before November? I think by now that's impossible that it would go to a verdict by November down in Atlanta. So anyway, just a side note on that.
No, that's interesting. That's really interesting, actually. I always wonder, to what extent, as you say, you can be in right-wing media, and it's probably smart, as your pal Adam Schiff suggests, to show up in right-wing media. But if you're just going to be, pilloried and not allowed to get a word in edgewise, then, why do it? I have questions for you from the chat, and I have questions from you.
Go for it.
That we've been sitting on, but I also just want to dovetail with what we were just speaking of. I know it's not in the course of politics and the future of America necessarily the top legal story, but it is from the standpoint of breaking news in the last couple of days. This Dodger star, Shohei Ohtani, okay, we were just talking about this. His interpreter has been fired. There are accusations that the interpreter stole millions from Ohtani to place bets with an illegal gambling operation. This all just came to light, and it's a very high-profile situation both for Ohtani and for baseball. And I was just suggesting, I know there's no way for you to really know this, but maybe you can just give me some sense of this unfolding case, what's legal, what's not. I was suggesting that maybe he's being made the fall guy for what might be actual gambling on the part of the star of Otani. Your thoughts?
Well, that would be a huge story if that's what ends up happening. One of the suspicions I've had, they keep saying, well, there was no betting on baseball. And the translator, that's his story. And he's told quite a few different stories just in the last couple of days. But he keeps saying the one thing he's consistent on is that he never bet on baseball. But, you know, if you're desperate for money and by now somebody's in the hole $4.5 million and the sport they know best is baseball, you really are worried that maybe there was some betting on baseball. Why bet on college football and the NHL when you're in and out of baseball every single day? And of course, that would bring you into the area that's in some ways even, worse than Pete Rose. It's kind of like the Black Sox scandal of 100 years ago. And of course, they were wonderful, loved players, but they fixed the World Series because they were under the control of gamblers. And, talk about speaking to the choir. We have the station that shall not be named that decided to throw their lot in with sports betting tips and not with the great reporting that you were doing, that John Rothman was doing, that Pat Thurston was doing on that station. Suddenly went to this sports betting. Sports betting's very lucrative. I think that MGM Grand was behind this. And there's an MGM Grand aspect to all of this, Mark, because just to give you a little bit of history, it's a fascinating case that actually begins with my old office, the Central District of California and federal prosecutors. If Shohei Ohtani is a Dodger who hits the stand in federal court, he may be the first Dodger since Tommy Lasorda. I called Tommy Lasorda to the stand. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he was a necessary witness in the case. I called Tommy Lasorda to the stand in federal court back in 1989. I know before some of your viewers were born, and I'd love to tell that story sometime. But the story here is that there was a gambling operation. Actually, Yasiel Puig, the famous Cubano, the Cuban outfielder for the Dodgers, and then he went to the Reds. He was also involved in that investigation. His case is actually up in the Federal Court of Appeals, but it has to do with this gambling ring of ex-baseball players, some minor leaguers, I think some major leaguers, and they had this gambling business. Now, you might say, how on earth could any normal person have a gambling business and compete with the MGM Grand and compete with the sports bookmakers? And bear this in mind, sports bookmaking is legal in about 40 states. You can just get on your phone if you're a young man or young woman, but unfortunately, it's an addiction that often hits young men, and you can bankrupt yourself. You can sit right there on your phone, bet on games, bankrupt yourself, tell your family you're coming home without your paycheck. In my opinion, the Supreme Court ruling about 5 years ago that allowed this to proliferate against the will of many states, I thought was a huge mistake. But anyway, here we are. And you might say to yourself, how do you compete? And here's how you compete, Mark. You give credit. The casinos don't give credit, but the illegal bookmakers, the unlicensed bookmakers, they give you credit. So this gang gave credit, and one of them got raided by the federal authorities, this investigation handled by the Central District of California. He got raided last October, and then they get all the computers and they get the betting sheets, and lo and behold, this interpreter is on there. And then there's apparently two transactions of about $500,000, which have Shohei Ohtani's name on it. Now, many things could be true of these $500,000 betting slips. That was real live money that got paid to this bookmaker. They could have been paying off the marker, right, of the interpreter, and it could have been Ohtani making him a loan. It could have also been all the possibilities. It could have been Ohtani's money, and Ohtani was the one betting, and that this was just his fall guy. This was his straw guy who was putting up the bets for him. And it could have been, several other things. It could have been one of the stories of the interpreter, Mark, was that he went to Ohtani and told him, I'm a gambling addict. I'm so sorry. I put all this money in. And of course, you're always worried how the extrajudicial methods of collection of some of these guys who you get in a hole to over $1 million on bets. The old joke in New York was, you see a guy hobbling around on one knee, he got collected on. I'm not saying that these guys collected that way. I'm saying if you go to your friend and you say, look, I owe $4.5 million, and he's really your friend and he has a $700 million contract on the horizon, he might lend you the money. So his story was on ESPN, this translator, that's exactly how it went down, that he went to Otani. He told him he owed all this money, that Otani hadn't bet any money on baseball, that he, the interpreter, had, and now he was way in the hold to these illegal or unlicensed gamblers, and would he bail him out, and that the money is to bail him out. Before that story could actually hit, I guess Otani lawyered up. He got some local LA lawyers. The LA lawyers put out a statement on behalf of Otani that said that he was the victim of a theft. Presumably, the $4.5 million, his story is, was stolen from him, embezzled from him. And that raises all these kinds of questions, Mark, which is why I love federal criminal law. I love both sides of it. But some of the questions are, how do you steal $4.5 million from somebody? Do you do it all at once and they notice $4.5 million is gone? Do you do it 20 times every time that you're betting and the person never knows that 20 different amounts of money is missing? And so there's an awful lot of explaining to do. Nobody wants to answer questions anymore. The alleged gambler's lawyer put out a very succinct story that he, the gambler, did not know Otani. This fellow, the interpreter, has put out very many stories. He's been fired. He was making about $300,000 or $400,000 himself, by the way. He worked for the Angels as interpreter, and then he worked for the Dodgers as an interpreter. And then Otani is not speaking, and manager Roberts is not speaking. So that's about where we are. But I love this story. It combines baseball, my favorite sport, and federal criminal defense, one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah, and I think that you ask a really great question. By the way, big shout out to Ron Cook, who gives us a super sticker.
Big
for 20.
shout out.
I wonder how it's possible to steal $4.5 million. So you'd need to, it almost suggests no other explanation but that he was given the money under a false pretext. If you are creating this story and narrative about how, I, the translator, had the problem and my pal was just bailing me out, he'd have to have been doing that with one fell swoop, I think. But when they say stolen, it's like, stolen how? I mean, if he asked him for the bailout and he gave him the bailout, it wasn't stolen. So it's weird. I mean, if that's the story they're going with, stolen, then I think your question is a really compelling one. What do you mean stolen? How was it stolen? Over what period of time? Fascinating.
I think it also raises the question, and then I know there's other things you probably want to talk about, but I think it also raises, just a whole lot of questions about, why has baseball, like football, made its deal with the devil, with this commercial gambling? Obviously, they want the money so bad, but, a couple of times baseball has almost been destroyed by scandals. Attendance was way down after the steroids thing. People thought that was just ugly and awful. And, some people who would have been great players, in my opinion, like Barry Bonds, didn't need steroids. He might not have had quite those numbers, but he was a great player before it's ever alleged that he used steroids. But it really hurt the game. And I was not alive then, Mark. I want it clearly understood during the Black Sox scandal. But that almost destroyed baseball. And they had to have some really strict rules. And maybe baseball has to have this rule that it doesn't want to move a franchise to Las Vegas, that it doesn't want to get so close to all of this gambling stuff. You have the whole thing with shaving points and everything else. And if people start to think that the game isn't really kosher, what does Trump say? It's rigged, it's fixed. But games can be rigged and fixed, especially when you're betting numbers. So you don't have to throw the game. You just have to shave points, shave runs, give up a home run to a guy in the 8th inning of a meaningless game. And if people come to feel that way about the sport, I don't know. But for now, they've made their deal with the devil. By the way, I don't know if it's still worth that, but they say the opening day, Dodger Stadium, when they actually open in Los Angeles, $565 to get in.
Yeah.
Don't bring your kids. Don't bring your kids on opening day, unless you're a real one percenter.
Well, again, the reason that this is a story worth spending any time on is because of this figure. He's a transformational figure in baseball. And as you suggest by that last comment, the Dodgers will make a fortune. I know he's making a fortune. Dodgers will make multiples of that fortune off of the revenue that comes in around Ohtani. Now, we'll follow this. Screw baseball, says Phineas. I want to know about Judge Cannon telling the jurists to ignore the law. Can you speak to now the Judge Cannon judge is in Florida, right? That's the document case.
Yes, the documents that this national security documents that Trump took out of the White House, had no business to take, hid all over Mar-a-Lago, said they weren't there. Then the FBI went in, and lo and behold, despite the certifications and the statements by his own lawyers, who'd apparently been bamboozled by Trump, that they were not there. Of course, the FBI came in and found loads and loads of them. Those are the ones with the red and gold labels that we've all seen. You could see just from looking at them that they were highly secure national security documents. Worse than that, obstructing justice, not giving them back, playing games, misleading the government. He also apparently flaunted them, flashed them at people, and talked about the only defense that he has on that charge, that he not only had and failed to give back highly sensitive national security documents, and that he then showed them to people and bragged that he had them in his hand, was that he's a huge liar, and all he had was his lunch menu in his hand, and he flashed that around as though they were national security documents. When that's your best defense, you may be Donald Trump.
So what about this judge? Look at this. Deeply problematic. Experts question judge's intervention in Trump inquiry. Eileen Cannon under fire as Trump witnesses speak out. Disturbing. A thorough rebuke of Judge Eileen Cannon's pro-Trumper order. Florida federal judge Eileen Cannon slammed by appeals court in Trump case. Can you speak to this, asking both sides to come up with juror instructions?
Well, one of the great things that I love about America is that, the judge in the Washington, D.C. case, Judge Chutkan, was born, I think, in the Caribbean islands, maybe Jamaica. And Judge Cannon was born in Colombia, the country of Colombia. And, that people can come to this country and can do so well is great, this is Judge Cannon. So I don't hold it against her that she's from Colombia. I certainly don't hold it against her that she was a former assistant U.S. attorney, which I was myself. But she seems very Trumpy. She was picked by Trump toward the end of his term. She's down there right up the road. When he had the search warrant that was executed, he found a way to go around the magistrate judge and try to run to her courtroom, where he knew he was going to have her because she was the only judge up there in Fort Pierce, just north of Mar-a-Lago. And then she made two rulings, Mark, which were both so bizarre, having to do with the search, that she was reversed by very conservative pro-government judges on the circuit. And it's so interesting that I say that, because conservative and pro-government used to mean the same thing with judges during the era that I was an assistant U.S. attorney. And now the irony is that it's the government that's making these very normal searches, very normal filings in front of her. And she seems to do two things. First, she ruled against them and got overturned twice. So people are thinking that the third time is not the charm. So they're thinking that all she wants to do now is delay things, that she wants to find the way to sit there and contemplate, think about it, hear it some more. As long as she doesn't have a ruling, the only thing that they can, if she makes a strong ruling for Trump, they can go to the federal appellate court again, Mark, and they can try to have her not only reversed this time, the third time, but thrown off the case as someone who just has brought a bias to the case. And now it's evident from the third time that they go to the appellate court. So she's smart enough to want to avoid that. And so it's just a kick the can down the road. It's just to run out the clock. And if all the experts now see the case in that perspective, is this something that really helps get the case to trial and to move it along? Or is this something that tends to run out the clock? And these latest rulings seem like they're just running out the clock.
So you're saying even as they're bizarre and they just now fall into that category and there's little recourse. I mean, it's just, as you say, she's watching not to be so outrageous so as to talk of replacing her in any way on this case, I mean. But she's able to be outrageous enough to, essentially create a time killer, which is what he wants, right? A delay.
The federal appellate courts, when they review a matter, have the right to send it back to a trial judge. But it's not on the criterion that your listeners and viewers might think, just, well, they've made a third mistake. That certainly helps trying to get a new judge assigned to the case, that the same judge has now made a third mistake. But it's something about the ruling, something about an expression of bias on the record or stuff like that. And I think that she's been very careful about that. And she's hung her hat on the fact that there are multiple defendants in that case. They sort of felt like they needed the multiple defendants because Trump did things by giving orders. Remember, one idea it looked like that was floated around, and I used floated around intentionally, was to overflow the swimming pool, and then have the swimming pool flood the documents room, and all the computers would be destroyed. It reminds me of the old joke, and Trump is, of course, a New Yorker. I'm sure he's heard this joke when he was a kid like I did. Do you mind if I tell a joke real quick?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so there's three guys who are in trouble with the board. And the first guy comes in and he says, well, I told the examiners that, we had a big fire. All the documents went up in flames last night. The other guy who's being called to the inquiry, he says, well, that's amazing because I told the board that, we had a big flood last night and all the documents were washed away. And the third guy says, yeah, I went in there and told them that we had an earthquake. And the other two say, how do you fake an earthquake?
All right, so now to that's canon. Let's quickly touch base on Georgia and the Fani Willis situation.
Well, I touched on it in the beginning, Mark, that the trial is going ahead.
And you think that, right,
with Fani and whoever she puts on it from her office. I thought it might be a good idea to get a special prosecutor. Remember, they tried to have that former Republican governor of Georgia. He testified during the Fani Willis hearings because the special prosecutor was supposed to be the head of a search committee. He was the head of a search committee, and he genuinely tried as the head of the search committee not to hire himself, but to hire this former Republican governor. And the Republican governor got on the stand at the hearing and he said, look, I didn't want to have my life threatened for the rest of my life. I'm an older person. I want to spend the rest of my life happily. And, it was obvious from what he was saying, not having some Trump deranged people who are not understanding that, we're living in a democracy and you win and you lose and you try to win the next one. If you lose the last one, it would retaliate against him. And he didn't want the case. So it may be that by now to get a special prosecutor in there just is going to take too much time. I'm sure she has some very fine assistant district attorneys in her office. Give it to them. And my advice to her would just be have them move this ball forward. Stay out of it yourself. Okay. No one says that because you're still the head of the office that you have to personally run this case. And she can say, look, I'm running my office. I'm running for re-election. I put this in the hands of the best people in my office, and they're moving the case to resolve the motions and to have a trial just as soon as possible. That's what I would do if I were her. And I think she probably is going to survive all these other inquiries because I think at the end of the day, she did not have an actual conflict of interest. Again,
Sure.
She made herself and that office look terrible with her tremendous lapse in judgment. I agree with that. But the case is not about her. The case is about Donald Trump and his co-defendants and what they did to steal the election down there in Georgia, which included a taped phone call. This case has the best piece of evidence of probably all of these cases. They have Trump getting on the phone when he knows he's more than 11,000 votes behind. There's been a count. There's been a recount. There's been no issues at all of fraud or anything else. He just plain lost. And that's when he calls up and in his own voice says to that Secretary of State down in Georgia, find me 11,500 votes. It's devastating on top of all the other evidence they have against him, Giuliani, Meadows, you name it.
All right, then, and I will double back and get to this question. I guess I'll just get to it now, Paul, and then I want to get to New York and the money and the likely seizure and can you trace money if he were to be rescued? I'll get to all of those questions in a second with David Katz. This question from Paul, how can an appointed federal judge be removed? Cannon doesn't seem to be qualified for her judgeship.
Well, they can try to impeach her. Remember trying to impeach Donald Trump with the overwhelming evidence of the January 6th insurrection, and they couldn't get enough Republicans in the Senate to vote that he should be removed from office. So they're not going to get them on Cannon. So that's not going to happen. If the Judicial Circuit thought that she was really disabled, either physically or mentally in some way, they could reduce her docket. That's not going to happen. And so the only way she could be removed from this case, which I think is what your questioner is asking, is again, if one of her cases went up to the appeals court and the appeals court said, we're not only reversing her, but enough of this already. She's just not trying to get it right in the opinion of that appellate panel. Then they would send it back to a different a judge. There's lots of them. It's a big area. Fort Pierce isn't big, but that district, we talked about that entire district of Southern Florida includes Miami, Fort Lauderdale. There's loads of other judges. They pick one at random, and that would be the new judge on the case if the circuit court removed it.
It's very hard to remove a judge. I remember the story that I shared with everybody who is a viewer or listener to the show about the older judge, very old, who is now kind of losing it a little bit. And they try to reduce the docket the way you suggested, David Katz, but he still is aware that his docket isn't as full as it should be, and he gets angry about it, even as he is sadly kind of segueing into Looneyville, and they still are unable to remove that guy. Now I'm thinking, wow, I mean, you have demonstrable evidence. I remember the article just had example after example of him really kind of losing his mind. And yet there was a real problem with trying to remove him. And he was certainly not going to go on his own. So it for me, embodied a bit of what you're talking about, which is the difficulty in actually removing somebody from the bench. Let me just ask you about
the theory, Mark, is that they're given protections that will allow them to stand up to an overbearing government, to an enormous corporation trying to throw their weight around. And of course, some people look at some of the federal courts and think, wow, that's unbelievable to see so many judges ruling for the government and for the huge corporations. But the idea was to give them protection so they could really stand up and be independent, be a separate branch of government.
Makes sense. Totally makes sense. New York Attorney General now taking initial steps to prepare to seize Trump assets is the headline. The New York Attorney General's office has filed judgments in Westchester County, the first indication that the state is preparing to try to seize Donald Trump's golf course and private estate north of Manhattan known as Seven Springs. Can you speak to this process? And then I have a question about bailout money coming from the Saudis or Russians or another source, and would that be revealed in court as to the source of those funds?
Well, to answer your first question first, the way that we got here was nothing unfair. First of all, this happens all the time. It happens, for instance, in criminal cases. If you think about it, somebody loses at trial and then they want to get out on bail pending appeal. Of course, as a federal criminal defense attorney now, doing a lot of white collar cases, I've been in that situation where somebody gets convicted by the jury, but you think you have a great argument on appeal and you want to keep the person out on bail pending appeal. So the person might have been out just on a signature bond, but now the judge wants a house or something like that. And the reason is that because people who lose either criminal cases or civil cases want the delay. Everybody wants the delay. And so if Trump could not pay somebody for 3 or 4 years and then show up at the end where he's lost everything and said, wow, guys, I'm broke. I'm really sorry you don't get the money and I lost the appeal, but I'm broke. You can't have that under the rule of law. So there's nothing unfair that you have to put up a bond. Now, the bond's one of two things. You can put up real property. He certainly doesn't want to put up $500 million of real property. He doesn't want to say, okay, here's Trump Tower, here's 40 Wall Street. If I lose the appeal, it's yours. He doesn't want to do something that definitive. He wants to put up a bond where if he loses the appeal, which remember, 2 or 3% of appeals succeed, okay? So he's got a 98% chance of losing and having to pay. So if you're the bonding company and you've agreed to pay $500 million plus interest, let's say it's $600 million by then, Mark, okay? They don't want friends in high places. They don't want favors. They have stockholders who want to know what the hell we did with our $600 million, because if the state wins the appeal, and they have a 98% chance of winning it, statistically probably, then you, if you're Chubb, you have to pay $600 million. And if Trump doesn't have it, the assets all turn out to be worthless. You have to dig in your shareholders' pockets if you're Chubb and pay the $600 million. That's why no one's going to give him the money, because he hasn't posted enough that's going to make them feel secure that if they have to pay $600 million, they won't lose, that they'll really have stuff from Trump that's worth $600 million, so they won't have to pull it out of their pocket, their own pocket, okay? That Trump has not come up with. Now, Trump has a couple of avenues at this point. One is to go to the appeals court, which he's doing, and have the appeals court say, well, there's something extraordinary about your case, so you don't have to post the $500 million. Or, of course, he wants to kind of schnorr them, as we say in Yiddish. He wants to schnorr them into taking $100 million when he owes $500 million. But you can't write that decision. There's no appellate judge who can write the decision that, well, because it's Donald Trump and because this and that and the other thing, the man has a judgment against him for $500 million. We're going to say $100 million is fine. It's like if somebody said my client is to post $100,000 bail, and I said, well, here's 20, the clerk would look at me, the courts would look at me. So the other thing that he could do, but it's complicated, is he could borrow the money. And I think that takes you to your question about the Saudis and the Russians. That would have to be disclosed. The nature of things, if he got that from some dark money outlet, these journalists, if they're worth their salt, would get to the bottom of it.
But wait. Let me stop you there. That's a huge distinction. You're saying it's one thing for journalists to uncover it. It's another thing for the law to require disclosure.
Well, I'm not quite sure, because remember, you've got to show up with a bond, and the bond has to be accepted. Okay. The bonding agency, I think you could not fail to disclose what the bonding agency was. But if Trump shows up on Monday and he says, you know what, forget the bonding agency. What did you say? 450 million. So I've got to post that plus a premium for interest and everything else. Here's $550 million. Of course, the question would be, who the hell just lent him $550 million? I'm not sure the law would require him to say where the $550 million was from. If it was in cash and it was good and it was posted with the court.
Sure.
Now, in criminal cases, in federal criminal cases, they say they want to know the source, because they're always worried that, let's say, the cartel is now bailing out the guy, and the guy is being paid for his silence, or he's going to run away and the cartel just bailed him out. They want to know in federal criminal cases who posted the bail, who's the real source of the bail. But here, Trump would be the source of the bail. It would be a civil bail. It is a civil case after all. And now he's got the $500 million. So it might be that the journalists would have to get to the bottom of that. But I think that they would. And then there's these disclosure forms, whether Trump, he'd have to get back into the presidency. Oh, my God. And then he'd have to have this requirement, which he'd have to obey. But you'd have to fill out these forms, that who are you indebted to? And he'd be indebted, $550 million to the same Saudi princes, let's say, who gave his son-in-law the $2 billion to play with, despite the fact that his son-in-law had very little investment experience. I just think it's too hot. I think it's too hot to do that. So my prediction on it is that Trump probably he tries to get more time from the attorney general, or he does really let the clock run out because he likes the political view of them seizing the properties. That would not be putting padlocks on there. There wouldn't be, New York State troopers in the lobby of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue.
I didn't realize that. I thought that is the way they proceed. You're saying
no, they would put some kind of liens on it. They would go give notice. They would maybe collect the rents, for instance, right? That might be one thing they could do. All the people who pay rents, let's say the stores in the lobby of Trump Plaza, would pay the rent to the attorney general. And they would they have a receiver. You got to remember that, Mark. They have a receiver on the whole Trump organization, this retired federal judge. So to make a long story short, it wouldn't be that dramatic. Going to a golf course is less dramatic than going through the lobby of 40 Wall Street. And I have to say one last thing for the people who don't remember it from my last appearance. I worked on Wall Street only one summer in my life. That's the thing you do if you're a law student and you have good grades and they hire you. You work as a summer associate. I worked as a summer associate in 1979 at 40 Wall Street. It's a beautiful big building. And, they had on one of the stations, they had how much money he actually has in those buildings. And it's not like he owns the entire building and gets all the rents. So apparently the biggest Trump Tower is I think the biggest moneymaker. 40 Wall Street's another big moneymaker. But in some of them, he only has an interest of like $20 million. I mean, he's got like his own penthouse or his own, he's got the lobby. He's maybe got the retail space. So I think what they would do is they would put liens on them, and they would say, okay, now we're up to $100 million, Mark. We're still not at $500 million. And I just have to think that Trump would. I think he may not have much choice but to let it happen, because if he's going to borrow the money, who's really going to lend it to him? Some multi-billionaire who's going to mark himself or herself forever as a Trump enabler. And the boycotts that would, I don't know. I don't know how this really works. I don't know how much, let's say, Musk is connected with Tesla. Okay. But it used to be so cool to have a Tesla. I don't know, a Tesla from Musk, who's the only person in the world who bailed Trump. And as I say, Trump owes the money. Here's the argument I want to hear, because this is what you have to say in a federal case. Let's say you want your client out on bail. If your client's not a flight risk, they don't think they're going to run away. They're not a danger to the community. They're not like doing ongoing scams or something like that. That's the average person. Then the Court of Appeal says, no, your client still doesn't get out because the presumption of regularity that you lost this lawsuit, okay? What are your issues? What are your substantial issues on appeal? What should we be looking for? And they decide that within weeks, whether somebody gets bail pending appeal or not. If you remember Peter Navarro, Chief Justice Roberts just had that. And it's not that much work. He said, tell me your issues. You tell me yours, and the government tells you why there aren't issues. And he said, you know what? You don't have issues. He didn't need to read all the briefs and hear all the arguments. He read what he needed to read from both sides. And he said, Peter Navarro, you don't have an argument on appeal. I can see that. And I haven't heard anyone say, what are Trump's arguments on appeal? That's another reason why the appeals court, I don't think is going to give him any kind of break. Because remember, he didn't have a jury trial because he didn't ask for one. The judge seemed to handle this case in a very measured way. He let Trump testify. They had rules what Trump could testify to. They made sure it was relevant. He let the sons testify. This Weisselberg testified on behalf of Trump. You remember that? And they determined that it was perjurious. I think he actually got, but he let that testimony in. He dealt with it. He gave it what weight he thought it deserved. I don't remember. Maybe you remember, Mark, if you followed it more closely than I did, or some of your listeners did, and they want to write in. I don't remember what were the big issues in that case. The one with Engoron. It looked like a very clean trial. He said that his apartment was worth 3 times what it was. He said his apartment was 3 times the size that it was. They had chapter and verse of how he cheated those banks. And the fact that some of the banks, or maybe all the banks, ended up making money. I pointed this out before, Mark. You and I get together and we claim we're worth $2 billion, and we get someone to lend us $2 billion, and we get lucky enough that this thing that we had no collateral on went to $2.5 billion. Everyone in America knows you can't do that. We just lied to a bunch of banks. And we can't gamble with their money. That's swindling them. We can't gamble with their money. And if the bet loses, they are holding the bag completely because you and I don't have $2 billion or anything close to it. That's totally wrong what Trump did. And there's the other aspect of it, that he then took the same assets that he overvalued to get those fancy loans and get better loan rates. And then he told the IRS and the state tax authorities, I'm broke. I can't pay. I'm a billionaire who can't pay taxes because it's worth $1 billion to the people I want to give me money, but it's worth nothing, tax people. Let me tell you my other theory of why it's really worth nothing to you guys. You shouldn't make me pay any taxes.
I want to get to the Texas border in a moment, but I just want to, because you mentioned Engoron. Apparently, Engoron yesterday expanded the role of the monitor overseeing the Trump organization on these funds that you're talking about to include a more expansive oversight of Trump's real estate business's internal financial practices, and has ordered the Trump organization to supply detailed information to that monitor about its efforts to obtain bonds to cover judgments. So again, to the question of could you find a Saudi angel or a Russian angel to come in and take care of this debt, it wouldn't likely get past the monitor without somebody knowing about it anyway. So I want to get to the Texas border, the back and forth being done with the Supreme Court and the appellate court. Maybe you can speak to that situation, just again, the legal logistics associated with it. It's always weird. We're now in this time where, and we talked about it last time when you visited, we're talking about judge shopping, or we were talking about these judges that are in these single judge counties where they get, then they'll put a stay in and that'll affect the entire country, et cetera. This is not so different in that the Supreme Court makes a ruling and then the Texas appellate court makes a ruling. Can you speak to this entire situation? This is about, the last thing I'll say, just to remind everyone, this is about essentially a vigilantism on the part of the sheriffs and other law enforcement authorities in Texas to actually deport immigrants who are illegally in the state of Texas for being there illegally. It's usually a federal jurisdiction, but this attempt is on the part of Texas to have local authorities deal with it.
One of their big obstacles is that Mexico won't take the people back. So they don't have really sort of anywhere to deport them to. The president of Mexico gave a speech and said this would be like one of our states in the middle of Mexico suddenly deciding what laws ought to apply to Texans in the middle of that state in Mexico. One nation deals with another nation. And the fact that Texas wouldn't have anywhere to send them is another problem that I don't think that they've really thought about. And then a lot of the people who are coming in right now into Texas are not from Mexico at all. They're from They're from Haiti, they're from other countries, they're from Venezuela. So they've come through Mexico, but it's totally fraught to think about what Texas would actually do. You're allowed to agree to voluntarily depart. They send all those buses into New York City and to Denver or wherever. I don't know if they're going to be sending planes to Haiti and Venezuela. I don't know if the taxpayers of Texas are going to think that's such a great idea to pay for that. But this whole question, and what you said about the going to these tiny little divisions where there's only one judge, like the way that they went to this judge in Amarillo, or in fact, the way that Trump went to Judge Cannon in Fort Pierce, the only one in that division. The Judicial Conference has decided to do something about that. And this is one time that Chief Justice Roberts gets a shout out because he's on the Judicial Commission. He's the head of the Judicial Commission. It's also the chief judges from the appeals circuits all around the country. And they decided to do something sensible about this judge shopping, where you try to get a statewide or nationwide injunction by taking it to the person is the friendliest judge anywhere to your cause. That's obviously wrong, whether the left or the right does it. The judicial branch did it. It was effective because Minority Leader McConnell freaked out and basically said, no, but we studied the country with all of these super right-wing judges so they could do exactly this. Don't you judges, some of you are Republicans, don't you get it? And the answer is, yeah, we get it. And that's not the way that we bring prestige and respect to the courts.
That's the judge shopping part of it. Okay.
Rampant judge shopping. Now, this last one you asked me about, this one at the border, this is like the federal courts exam. You can get like a point toward your federal courts exam. Any of you are in law school and you're taking federal courts or constitutional law, listen up, because this one really had a circuitous route, to use the word circuit. So the case starts out in Austin, Texas. It's not judge shop to some tiny little place like Amarillo. Texas passes this law, SB4, which basically says they can take immigration into their own hands. That's very controversial because the Constitution leaves immigration to the federal government, particularly the Congress, but it leaves it to the federal government. We're all one big country. And so to have 50 different states have different immigration policies really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it didn't make sense to the framers of the Constitution. They knew we had states. They knew that states would be interested in what migrants were in those states, but at the same time, they gave the jurisdiction not to the states, but to the federal government. That's not just me saying so. That was the U.S. Supreme Court saying so in the Arizona case about a dozen years ago. And in that Arizona case, Mark, that was the one that was, let me see your papers. And
that was Joe Arpaio.
Right. And that's the one that people are all scared about. People who think we need to do something about the border, we need to stem this flow, have to realize that these kinds of racial profiling is just a twin of these things. Racial profile comes along with it because they don't go up to people who look like you and me, Mark. They go up to people who are black and brown, especially brown. And that's the problem with the racial profiling. Sure, there's other ways that you could try to do that, but it's very fraught with racial profiling. The Supreme Court realized that. The Supreme Court also realized in the Joe Arpaio, Arizona, Show Me Your Papers case, that it's a federal responsibility. They decided that 5-3. One of the five, RBG, is no longer on there. The court is not 5-3 in the view of Arizona. It may now be 5-4 or even 6-3, the minority view. And so they tried to take that minority view and say, no, they're not at cross purposes in Texas. This is their argument. They're not at cross purposes with what the federal government's doing. They're trying to achieve the same thing as the federal government. So they should be allowed to supplement. Why can't a state supplement the federal government, even if it's the federal government's responsibility? Well, that's nonsense in this situation because people are getting to be aware of what we do at the border. And if you like it or you don't like it, what we do at the border, people do not sneak in, generally speaking. They run right over to a border patrol agent or immigration agent. They run right towards the U.S. official. And the U.S. official takes their name down and paroles them into the United States. So they are not here from that point illegally. Now, people who want to vote on this issue, people who like Trump, think that they should be here illegally. But right now, under the law, they are not here illegally. They're paroled into the United States until they can have their asylum hearing. And of course, with the scarcity of immigration judges and all the other problems, those asylum hearings don't happen for 5 or 6 years. And so the people are effectively here with some kind of permission. So for Texas to take the view that they're all illegals, right, or most of them are illegals, even the people crossing the border, because they say, well, at least give us the limited power, they told the appellate courts, the Solicitor General of Texas, at least give us the power to nab these people as they come across the border. Some of the people coming across the border have already made an appointment for this parole asylum hearing when they cross the border. That's why they're stacked up at the border listening to the Court of Appeals argument in the Fifth Circuit. Can we come? Can we not come? Now, the peculiarities of the case procedurally are that the Austin federal judge says, I'm not allowing this to go into effect. This doesn't look to me like this is going to win on the merits. So I'm deciding this law does not go into effect. He issues a stay of the law going into effect. The Fifth Circuit reverses that stay. So it goes into effect. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, this whole case shouldn't be in front of us. They keep the stay in effect. So that's why people say it was legal for 8 hours. But they said, look, you, the Fifth Circuit, got to solve this. It's sending this up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Amy Barrett and Kavanaugh say, no. The Fifth Circuit needs to decide this. So this is the 8 or 10 hours that it's actually legal to enforce this law. But no one can really, get to enforce it because there's so many bureaucratic hurdles. Is the sheriff going to get sued? They want to get further instructions. In that time, it goes back to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit says 2-1. You know what? That judge was right in the first place in Austin. We should stay this thing. And so now, while it's kicking around the courts, it's not going to go into effect. It's not going to change the law down there. And I don't think ultimately, Mark, it's from the questioning of the two judges of the three, or there's a Trumpy judge on there. The Trumpy judge would have let it go into effect. But the two judges, one is from Biden and one is from W. They were very skeptical of it. And I don't think that law is ever going to go into effect because it is at cross purposes with the federal law and the Supreme Court. Now, people say, the Supreme Court doesn't like precedent. So watch this. You're going to watch Dobbs. You're going to watch the guns in the New York pistol case where people are running around with guns at Yankee Stadium and saying that they have a right to get those permits. And this is not a court that really follows precedent. But I think they will follow precedent on this one. The Arizona case is quite clear, and the Constitution is clear. For the people who are textualists and originalists, the Constitution is quite clear, Mark, that this is federal jurisdiction. If you don't like the immigration policy of the country, vote for president, vote for Senate, vote for the House. But Abbott is not part of the federal government, and Abbott, as much as he's trying down there, is not, I think, going to be able to get that law SB4 to go into effect.
It seems straightforward, yeah. I mean, it's a federal jurisdiction. But wow, we covered a lot of territory, David Katz. You've been very generous with your time. I think we hit Otani, we hit New York, seizure, the satisfaction of the bond and traceability of that money. We talked about Georgia and Fani Willis. We talked about the document, the espionage case with Cannon and that craziness there. Wow. I mean, I think, yeah, impressive. David Katz rules, says Kathleen Bryant. I agree. So you've kind of snuck some predictions in as expectations. I mean by that, like you expect, or you said I wouldn't be surprised, is what you said, I think, actually, if Trump allowed these seizures to actually happen. Are you ready to make that a prediction, Katsadamas, or what prediction would you like to offer today to us?
I think that there'll be some liens put on properties and that he may have his, rents and receivables collected, again, to get to that amount. People say that maybe he'll drop his appeal, but I don't see any way that he'll drop his appeal. But the effect, I think, will be that his appeal will go forward, and he'll put up the bail that he can. One of the risks that he runs, though, is that they will bar him from appealing. So he's got really tick-tock. He's really got to play his cards right here. But I think his safest thing is to borrow as much money as he can. I do think if he can walk in there with a plan, let's say that he has $300 or $400 million, at some point, it'd be smart for the attorney general to take it. She's going to win the appeal. And, just the optics of having the appeal thrown out because, I had $300 million and they wouldn't take it. or make some deal that will take the 300 million, but you've got to come up with this much money. Keep his feet to the fire that he's got to get closer to the $500 million amount. So I think if he comes with an offer like that, that she's got some incentive. I don't think that she likes the optics too much of, New York state troopers going into one of the Trump iconic buildings like 40 Wall Street or Trump Tower. I don't think that she can touch Mar-a-Lago. She'd have to get the cooperation of authorities in Florida. So I think any property that's outside the state of New York, while, in theory, of course, you can collect it. Someone can't just stick all their assets someplace and go, ha, 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 screw all your judgments. Although people have tried to do it in Florida and some other, shall I call them sanctuary states for debtors. They have tried to do that in sanctuary states for debtors, but it's not worth her while to fool around with Florida. She'll go after the New York assets, but it won't be with New York state troopers going into the lobby. It'll be filing liens and doing things in the courts. And at some point she may argue, if he really only comes with $100 million, that's all he ever comes with, they'll probably throw his appeal out, because you have to post the bond in order to appeal. You got to get the delay. The thing is, you don't get the delay unless you post the bond, you post the money.
Absolutely wild. David, thank you. I look forward to seeing you across the media landscape between now and next time, but always love our time together. David Katz, everybody.
Great to be with you. Hi, Kim and your staff, too.
Yeah, right on, David, right on. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.